Hello friends, today we're going to be speaking about my 5-MeO DMT experience while we enjoy some tea together. So go ahead and get comfy and let's enjoy some story time. I want to differentiate between 5-MeO and NN-DMT because they're very different substances. NN-DMT is often very visual and involves a lot of fractals and is much more common, and it's also what's found in ayahuasca. Versus 5-MeO is harder to come by and is usually considered the most powerful psychedelic, and it is often much more transcendent of individuals. It is often described as light or dissolving into source. So very separate compounds, even though they both have DMT in the name, they're different molecules. NN is known as the spirit molecule, and 5-MeO is known as the God molecule. And usually if someone comes across DMT, it's usually referring to NN-DMT. So before we jump into the actual experience, I'm going to break this down into 3 sections. First, preparation. Second, the ceremony. And third, the integration, because a 5-MeO DMT experience is so much more than just those 15 to 20 minutes when you're actually in that space. It's about the journey, it's about the integration, it's about what one learned, how it transformed your life. So if you are going to be experimenting with 5-MeO DMT, my biggest advice is to make sure to prepare properly. Now, how does one prepare for that experience? Please know that if you prepare properly, it's like when you're working out and you have a really good warm-up, and then that leads to a good workout and leads to good recovery. If you skip the warm-up, you jump right into the workout, sometimes you can get away with it, but sometimes you get injured. And in 5-MeO DMT, it might be some sort of mental, avoidable kind of injuries. And then the recovery or the integration can be made a lot longer and more difficult. So the best way to integrate is to do a really good job at preparing. So how does one prepare? And the thing is, it's going to vary through person by person. This is what I did in my journey. So I prepared for my 5-MeO DMT experience for months. Months. And that was largely because the first time that I thought I was going to do it, it ended up not happening. By the second time where I actually did it, I had a lot more time that I had been preparing, but I think it was meant to be. It ended up being for the best. So I heard somewhere, I forget where, but someone told me to prepare for 5-MeO like you were preparing for death. And that might sound very intense, but I think that's the kind of intensity arguably the most powerful psychedelic on earth should be considered in, with that degree of intensity. So how does one prepare for death? Thankfully, 5-MeO DMT is actually pretty safe for the body, especially when done with well-trained, knowledgeable professional. But it's going to be usually a feeling of ego death, a very intense ego death. And that's what I mean preparing like you're gonna die. It's not about physical death, it's about preparing for that mental death that happens in that journey. So what does that entail? For some people, it may be just making sure they tie up all loose ends. Sometimes it's about calling someone up and telling you forgive them. Sometimes it's about writing letters of people you're letting go of feelings of anger towards and then burning them, or the letters, burning the letters. Or sometimes it's about calling your mom, and that's what I did. I called my parents, and I'm very vocal to them about my psychedelic usage for ceremonial purpose. So I called them and I told them, hey, I'm going to be doing a pretty powerful ceremony. Can I have your blessing? And they both gave me their blessing, which helps me go into it with a very beautiful feeling and making sure that my relationship with both of them was really good and was on a good note. And with all the people that are very dear to me in my life, I had no loose ends, and I prepared myself also physically this is something that I took more from ayahuasca ceremonies, which I had worked with ayahuasca a couple times before 5-MeO. So I also integrated a lot of ayahuasca. I'm originally from Colombia, and the indigenous in Colombia and in the Amazon work with yahe, ayahuasca. So trying to honor those traditions through doing the ayahuasca diet, which is a very plain diet, and making sure I wasn't consuming any substances up until that point, so avoiding any recreational substances, just doing a deep cleanse, eating very pure, unprocessed foods, a lot of fruits and vegetables, avoiding sugar and salt, that kind of thing. And again, this diet is going to vary from person to person. I recommend maybe looking into the ayahuasca diet, but what's important is not exactly the diet itself, but putting an intention to eat the healthiest foods possible. People have very different definitions of what they consider healthy, but eat whatever feels very healthy for you. And definitely avoid like eating fast food and stuff. I think we can all agree that's pretty unhealthy. So eating clean, and then besides doing the preparing one's gonna die and preparing in the ayahuasca ceremony format, which also involves no sexual energy. You can look up the exact guidelines for preparing for ayahuasca. So is that I was also doing the Buddhist 8 precepts. So the 8 precepts of Buddhism, they're not like sins. Some people confuse them with them being like sins. They're not. They're rules to deepen your practice, to deepen your meditation practice. So I did the 8 precepts of Buddhism leading up to it as much as I could, which involved things like not eating afternoon, so fasting afternoon, sleeping on a hard surface, so sleeping on the ground. So I went to very, I would say, far lengths to prepare myself, and that resulted in very wonderful results. So I think what's important is to go into it feeling like one thoroughly prepared, one's mind, body, and spirit. So physically, with my food and with my diet, I cleansed my body as much as possible. Mentally, I was avoiding listening to a lot of music. I was avoiding watching shows, consuming a lot of high vibrational spiritual books. And spiritually, I was meditating a lot. I was journaling. And very importantly, I was very clear on my intention on why I was doing this medicine. It wasn't just out of curiosity or just like, why not? Or nothing like that. I knew it was a very deep spiritual ceremony, and I prepared for it as much as possible mentally and with clear intentions. So thorough preparation. Now the actual ceremony, let's see. So I had been meditating quite a lot up until that point. I would say this was vibrationally what felt like one of the highest frequency points in my life, where I was walking and just being fully present, feeling extremely blissful. My meditations were incredible. I was tapping into very beautiful spaces, very mindful, peaceful spaces. So when I did the ceremony, we did 3 hits, and the first hit was what the facilitator called a handshake. So it's a small amount to just get you acquaintance with the substance. So I did just a little bit, and it was very subtle. I laid down. It was just like a peaceful feeling just washed over me, very calm, very lovely. And then the second, which was supposed to be what would be considered a full dose, I actually just went into the same space that I do when I meditate very deeply. It was this very serene, beautiful, mindful space that I was very familiar with. And I came out of it, I would say a little bit, not disappointed, but it didn't seem as intense. And I expressed this, that was the same place that I went to in my meditations. And that was a very beautiful place, but that's what I do when I meditate anyways. It was a little shocking, and I laughed it off, and I was like, okay, let me go in for the 3rd dose, and I'll just enjoy that space because I'm pretty familiar with it. But the third dose was the actual, ended up being what I would consider the actual experience, what some people might consider breaking through. And the third dose was the full experience. I'm going to express that the experience itself is so transcending of the English language. I will do my best to communicate in mere words this experience. So it's almost as if everything I had ever experienced in life up until that point was wavelengths that went from highs to lows. Everything is frequency, light, sound, everything we perceive, frequencies. Sometimes my experience of reality will become very high frequencies. Sometimes it would go through low frequencies. But this was the only time that it felt like the frequency of my consciousness, instead of just going high, it went vertical, completely vertical. This is how I would describe that experience. Even though I would say I had tapped into that space, but barely, a few times through other means, such as mushrooms or very deep meditation or lucid dreams, I felt like there had been a few times where I had barely dipped my toes. And the first time being when I was 16, and I was the first time I did mushrooms, and I was laying in bed and I went into this pure consciousness realm, this realm of light. And I came out saying, I went to the place that I was before I was born, and I know I will go after I die. That was, for me, for a very long time, one of the most profound experiences I've had. But it wasn't only until I did 5-MeO that it put it into context, that I had really just dipped my toes. And 5-MeO was a full plunge into that space in a deeper way than I have ever in my previous experiences, where it almost became a whole new experience, even though I feel like they were the same place. It was just so drastic of a difference. It was like dipping your toes into a pool versus jumping in, full plunge. Very different experiences, even though you're touching the same water. Many people ask me, was I scared? And the answer is no, because there was no somebody to be scared. There was no somebody to feel fear or to feel delight. It was complete ego death. There was no longer any perceiver or perceived. In all other experiences, basically, except for very small glimpses of life, even the most intense DMT fractal experiences and most intense LSD or mushroom experiences, there is still a sensation of somebody witnessing this perceiver and that which is being witnessed. May it be the most intense fractals or the most epic visuals. But in this experience, that relationship between perceiver and perceived dissolved. It was no longer there. There was nothing, but it was everything. It wasn't like there was darkness. It wasn't like a lack of. It was more of being filled so deeply with infinity, with light, with source, where everything was there, yet it was empty of all. Fullness and allness existing at once. What a beautiful paradox. And the most intense feeling of love. Imagine the selfless, incredible love of a parent, of a mother to their child. Imagine that kind of love times a trillion, times multiple trillion. That's what it felt like. The most intense feeling of love and just pure light. There was nothing. There was no me. There was no, like, everything about my life just boom, gone. But it wasn't missing. It wasn't that it was gone. It was like all there, and there was so much more, but there was nothing. Again, English language falls so short. All human language falls so short to this experience. It was the highest frequency, pure consciousness. I remember feeling that super intense, pure essence of the frequency of love. It felt like the highest realm possible, like I had returned home. And that was the very freaky part also. It didn't feel like something new. It felt like a coming back to. I was feeling, oh, there was no me, but I knew. There was a knowing, a sense of knowing of every part of my consciousness that was it. I don't know how else to put it, but that was it. That was it. Right there. All of it. And I do remember the feeling of a sort of pulsing, like breath, like almost like the breath, like a pulsing. There was a pulsing, a very soft, gentle pulsing, and the feeling of infinity. It was almost like time completely broke and I was just dissolved into the ocean of infinity. And at one point, while being back in the infinite home of Source, I decided to come back and play this little role here on Earth as Juliana. And I repixelated back and came back into reality. And it felt like it had been infinite time. Like, even though technically it had been 15 or 20 minutes, there was no sensation of time in that space. There is no sensation of self. And afterwards, I actually found out, so when you're on 5-MeO, the reason it's so important to have a person there to facilitate, not doing it by yourself, a professional, is that your body goes on autopilot. It can do all sorts of weird things while you have no awareness. You're in this blissful space. At least my experience was very blissful. I know that there's stories of other people that haven't had as blissful experiences. And there's even other stories of people having visuals. For me, there was no visuals, but no like form-based visuals at least. I was told afterwards that while I was in that space, apparently I was screaming, which is so funny. And it wasn't a scream of terror. It was almost apparently like I was trying to it was a release, or I would say it was almost like the frequency got so high that all I could do to express that was to scream to try to match that frequency. But apparently I was screaming my lungs out. When I came back, I had zero recollection of it. And it's funny because probably to an outsider that wasn't a professional, it probably would have seemed like I was having a bad experience, maybe, but I wasn't at all. And I came back smiling and very grateful for that experience. The third part is integration. Integration, super important because you don't want to just breeze past that. And my integration, even though I did so much preparation, still that experience is so powerful. It can be a little bit of a intense integration. For a while, I felt so blissful, void of desires in the most positive way possible, that all I could do was just sit there and smile and meditate. And of course, I would still care for my body, go eat and stuff. But I had zero desires. It was the first time in my life where I had zero desires to make art, which for me has always been such a drive, such a passion. I always had this huge passion to create. And it was the first time that was just completely gone. And any sort of like subtle addictions that we have in day-to-day life, may that be to social media or sugar or this or that, the internet, they were completely voided, gone. I could just sit there and everything was done. I was fulfilled, which I ended up actually, I haven't told many people this, but here I am sharing on YouTube. I ended up actually emailing a monastery to want to ordain as a Buddhist nun because I was living by myself at the time. I wasn't in a relationship. I was just doing my own thing, being an artist. And at that point, I was like, if there's no more art, like all I want to dedicate my life to at this point is just meditating so I can reach that same space on my own. That space of being one with God, being dissolving into pure source, seeking enlightenment. So I attempted to ordain to a Buddhist monastery. It was a Deer Park Monastery from the Thich Nhat Hanh lineage. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, at the time, it was 2020, so the world was shut down and they were not taking any more monastics, so it gave me enough buffer time to think things through. And that's also, I think, an important thing to do, which I should have probably done a better job at, is don't take any huge drastic life decisions right after you do 5-MeO. I mean, even a few weeks after, it takes a good bit to integrate. Or maybe do. You might have an interesting journey. Who knows? Each to each their own. So if you want to take drastic decisions, it might lead you somewhere interesting. But am I glad that I didn't ordain? Feelings are mixed. It could have been an interesting path, but here I am. I didn't because of COVID. And I'm very grateful I ended up where I'm at right now, talking to you lovely people. But that experience, I ended up journaling a lot, and I still would say it's an experience that I hold the fondest in my heart. It's given me a lot of comfort regarding death, regarding transcending from this life. It's given me a lot of clarity of what I'm seeking in this life, which is enlightenment and union with Source. And overall, very positive experience. I'm very grateful I did it. It's been 5 years now since I had that experience, and there's currently no intense yearning to do it again. At the moment, maybe sometime in the future, I will feel called. I listen to my intuition. Perhaps it's once in a decade kind of experience, but that experience, I still like, even though it's been 5 years, I feel like it's still being more and more integrated. And it was also the only psychedelic experience where I had true flashbacks. People hear of having flashbacks from other psychedelics. I never had any sort of flashbacks from any psychedelic except for 5-MeO. I legitimately had full-on flashbacks, like moments where I was back in there. So it wasn't like it was just that experience. It was a gradual dissipation of other experiences that were from going full into it to slowly less and less. Usually when sleeping, or if I eventually, when I did psychedelics again, I went right back into that space. And every so often, even a few years after, I'd go back in, and it wasn't anything negative because it's like the most blissful possible state. So very grateful for when I did go back into it. At first, it caused a little bit of trouble with sleeping because I would, especially the days that followed, I would go back in and try to go to sleep, and I'd just be in that space and I'd wake up. So it was causing some sleeping troubles, but it went away after a while. I just had to be patient. But overall, the fondest experience of my existence, and incredibly beautiful. And I had the pleasure of seeing a handful of other people enjoy this medicine. And so many people had such wide degrees of experiences. There was people that did have visuals. There was people where they felt like it was a motherly presence. There was people and it seemed more like a regular psychedelic trip. But in my opinion, its full expression would be that expression of Source, and both dissolve into Source. But maybe that's just because that's what my experience was. But overall, it's inspired me deeply. It still inspires me day to day. And if you've tried 5-MeO, I'd love to hear about your experience in the comments. And if you'd like to see more videos on all things spirituality and guided meditations, and just be my YouTube friend, please subscribe, and would love to stay in touch. Thank you everybody for listening, and may you have a wonderful rest of your day.